Hello and welcome back. Once again, I am Ashok Rajguru, your tutor. And in this video, we shall be taking a look at the math behind symptom choice. Yes, indeed, there is a mathematical and statistical truth behind choosing the correct symptom. And that is exactly what we shall be taking a quick look at during this video. But before we go into this serious topic, let's take a look at a wonderful cartoon by Dilbert, which will sum up what we intend to do in this video, or rather what we intend to avoid doing in our analysis. So here goes Dilbert. The boss is telling his assistant, use the CRS database to size the market. And the assistant says, that data is wrong. The boss replies, then use the SIBS database. Oh, that data is wrong too, says the assistant. Well, you can average them, can't you? And the assistant is equally humorous. Sure, I can multiply them too. The moral of the story is very often homeopaths use the wrong data or they use the data incorrectly. And that's exactly what we shall be seeing in this video. The objectives of this lesson are to acquire knowledge, to develop a good professional attitude, and hone our skills as practitioners. As far as knowledge is concerned, we will see how we are going to develop a strategy to determine the hierarchy of symptoms on a rational, scientific basis. As far as developing the proper professional attitudes are concerned, we shall learn how important it is to avoid bias as a practitioner, which is what Hahnemann has exhorted us over and over again in the organon of the medical art. And as far as skills are concerned, we shall learn how to apply classical principles to repertories, and we shall see what is meant by the term synthesizing a rubric to cover a symptom completely. I'm now going to introduce a new term which comes from statistics. This statistical term is known as likelihood ratio, and that provides a very good basis for a good analysis of any case that you are going to handle. Now, what exactly is likelihood ratio? For those of you who wish to pursue this topic in more detail, I would highly recommend a book called Signals and Images, which is edited by Leonie Bonamine. And the subtitle of this book is Contributions and Contradictions About High Dilution Research. So those of you who wish to pursue this further would gain tremendously by perusing through this book. Now, likelihood ratio has been defined as a ratio that expresses the relationship between the prevalence of a symptom in a population with illness to the prevalence of the symptom in the population without the illness, which is the general population. I'll talk more about this, and we'll just see what is the second important point to note. In order to understand likelihood ratio, if I say that the likelihood ratio is equal to 1, what it means is that the particular symptom which is being reported by a person in sickness or by a certain number of people in sickness is the same as that which you would find in a healthy population. For example, if you enter a room with say 100 people and you are looking at a patient and the patient says that he is feeling very hot and that he wishes to remove his clothes to feel better, that would certainly be a very important symptom. But if you were to inquire with the rest of the people and they were to also complain the same thing, that the room is very hot because of poor ventilation, and in fact they all have the same desire to either get out of the room or to take off their clothes or loosen their clothing, then it would mean that the likelihood ratio is equal to 1, because the same symptom is appearing in the person reporting sickness as well as those who are healthy. This is very important because the whole concept of symptom in homeopathy is based on the fact that it is something which is reported by the patient in the state of sickness and which is different from what the patient is in a normal state of health. Very important when we come to repertorial analysis. Once again, if a symptom is having a low likelihood ratio, it is of little value to us. The higher the likelihood ratio or the bigger the number, the greater is the importance. In the slides that follow, we shall be taking a closer look at this concept to understand the basis of repertorization. Here is the book which I mentioned in case you have missed the name. It is Signals and Images. The subtitle is Contributions and Contradictions About High Dilution Research. It's a book of essays edited by Leonie Bonamine. The whole concept of repertorial analysis and therapeutics in homeopathy is based on the fact that we are trying to match the symptoms produced by a remedy in healthy people versus a symptom reported by the patient. This itself means that there is some statistical basis for that. In other words, the past indicates the future. The past is the proving of the remedy or the clinical report about the remedy's efficacy and the symptoms presented by the patient. Take for example, loquaciousness. Now, one remedy that comes to the mind immediately is lachesis. So we say that more loquacious patients will respond to lachesis than patients for whom other remedies are indicated. Similarly, if the patient says that you find the patient is very loquacious and he also or she also feels uncomfortable with clothing or any tightness around the neck like a pullover or a necktie or a scarf, then the indications for lachesis are even stronger because the LR or the likelihood ratio is much higher because the general population does not feel the same symptom. So once again, a high likelihood ratio means that it is more prevalent in the sick versus the healthy. Please note, I have boxed the term sick. In other words, that symptom in that person should be in a state of sickness, not as a personality trait or temperament. This point has been emphasized over and over again in season 1 in almost all the cases that we had taken up for study. Now, this is coming from statistics which was developed by one particular statistician whose name was Reverend Thomas Bayes. Now, Reverend Thomas Bayes was an Englishman and he was a pastor as well as a mathematician, and he is the person who developed statistics as we know it today. So when the Surgeon General says that smoking is injurious to health, that particular warning derives from Bayesian statistics. That means the statistics and the laws developed, or one particular theorem which is of particular importance and was developed by Thomas Bayes. One point which is very interesting to note is that Reverend Thomas Bayes lived between the years 1702 and 1761. Hahnemann's time was 1755 born and he passed away in 1843, which means that when Reverend Thomas Bayes died, Hahnemann was just 6 years old. My contention is that most likely Hahnemann was aware of these mathematical theories. He was a very widely read man and he knew English, German, French, Greek, and Latin to such a proficiency that he could translate books from one into another. So such a learned man, a person with such a wide grasp of knowledge and who had such intelligent friends like Bonninghausen, who was also a polymath, I am very certain that Hahnemann was aware of the implications of the discoveries and theories of statistics uh, which were prevalent before he was born. So I think that probably lies at the foundation of our repertorial analysis as developed by Hahnemann and by Bonninghausen. How can we use our knowledge of likelihood ratio in repertorization? Let's take one example of Rustox or Rustox, whichever way you wish to pronounce. We know that a Rustox patient is better by motion in the case of any kind of pain. In fact, bryonia is just the opposite. So suppose we say that a patient who is the number of patients who are better by motion are 10 times more frequent in Rustox than other patients, then we can say that the likelihood ratio is 10, because if this happens 50% of the time in Rustox patients and only 5% of the time in other remedy patients, then 50 divided by 5 works out to 10. So that is how the likelihood ratio can be worked out. Let's take another example. Hahnemann has said that rare and peculiar symptoms are most important. Supposing we were to take a Rustox symptom, which is cough after discouragement. Now, this particular rubric is having just one single remedy in grade 3, and that is again Rustox or Rustox. And let us say that only 2% of these Rustox patients actually exhibit this, while in other remedies, it is a very minuscule percentage of 0.01%. Now 2 divided by 0.01 works out to 200, which means that this peculiar symptom is of tremendous importance when it comes to repertorization. Continuing further, if we start taking more rubrics in our case analysis as we do, then we can see what are the chances of cure when we take the cumulative effect of taking all the rubrics together. I know this is quite mathematical and it's heavy going, but please bear with me. At least look at this table closely. If you have no symptom, then the chances of cure have been randomly put at 1%, something like a placebo effect. But if motion ameliorates, and we know that the LR or the likelihood ratio is 10, then you improve the chances of cure by 9%. If the patient also has a desire for cold milk, and the LR for that is only 6, still our chances of cure have increased from 9% to 37% with 2 rubrics. If we add a third rubric that cold wet weather aggravates, and the LR for that is even lower, just 4, still the chances of cure or finding the correct remedy have increased to 72%. So this is pure mathematics. Now let's look at the mind symptoms. Fear of doctors. Looking at it from the point of view of likelihood ratio, we find that 20% of the population has a fear of doctors, and in fact 3% of them have got an extreme fear of doctors. So that's a very small population, and the LR is apparently quite high and can be taken into consideration. Next comes fear of hospitals. The technical name for that is nosocomophobia. And one celebrity who suffered from this condition was President Richard Nixon. And the lifetime prevalence of this condition is about 14%. So that's a good symptom to take. But once again, as Bonninghausen has advised, mental symptoms should only be taken up at the confirmatory stage and not during the initial analysis. Also, this patient has mentioned that he is sensitive to injustice, and the interview has revolved around this for quite some time. Looking at the data available in the book which I mentioned earlier, the specific case of Staphysagrina has been quoted, And we are told that 11% of Staphylococcus aureus cases are sensitive to injustice, and the number for the general population is 10%, which means that the LR, or the likelihood ratio, is just 1.1. It's so close to 1 that it is really of no consequence when it comes to analysis. As a matter of fact, what would have been more important for the practitioner to elicit from the patient would have been what are the symptoms or sensations such as goose flesh, sweat, dry mouth, breathlessness when the person is facing that fear. But we are not having that information available with us. Next, let us take a look at the repertorial analysis given by the practitioners. There are 19 symptoms which have been taken to analysis, and there is just one symptom which only partially and inadequately covers the chief complaint, which is number 19 at the bottom of the whole table. It says there bladder, urination, dribbling, and large prostate width, and it shows only 15 remedies. Now this is a condition which is addressed by many more remedies, and it is totally inadequate to represent the chief complaint in such a lackadaisical manner. Let us go further. Just take a look at these rubrics. All of them are relating to admonition by the parent, by the father, by the rudeness and the honor that was wounded, and these are all small rubrics having 11, 12, 15, 26 number of remedies. These remedies should actually have been combined into one big rubric, and that is what synthesis is all about. Let's take the next lot. Here we have got ailments from domination in childhood, domination for a long time, from being neglected by a father. Once again, very small rubrics, all pointing to the same. And going further, here we have got ailments from cares and worries. We have got mind which has got full of cares. Once again, these need to be combined. Fear of narrow places and fear of suffocation. Now, why am I insisting on combining these rubrics? We shall just see that in a moment, that having so many rubrics which point to the same remedy over and over again actually weighs the dice heavily for one remedy only, and it will not allow other remedies a fair playing field to represent their qualities. As you can see in the box, all these remedies could have been grouped together and we would have had fewer than 19 rubrics to deal with a more descriptive picture of the person who is presenting the symptoms. Once again, this pink arrow is pointing towards the injustice, which should not be there at all in view of the LR, or the likelihood ratio, that we just discussed a few slides ago. If I were to regroup these symptoms, then Staphylococcus aureus score would drop from 38 to 12. Natmure would come up to a score of 11, and Lycopodium would be leading the pack with a score of 14. So here we have a classical example of a bad repertorial analysis without synthesizing the symptoms and leaving out the chief complaint altogether. Something very important to note, and something that one should not be overlooking in a properly done case. Let's now take a look at the shortcomings in the case analysis as presented by the homeopaths who have written up this case. The first shortcoming is that the chief complaint has not been completely addressed. Second, we have a very strong causation which has not been taken into account. Third, the practitioner is apparently not aware of the concept of likelihood ratio, and that is why a number of rubrics and symptoms have been taken to the analysis without weighing them in the light of the statistical chances of likelihood ratio. Fourthly, it is apparent that the practitioner is not aware how to synthesize rubrics. Combining and crossing rubrics is an art, and it's a very useful artifact if you are to get a successful case. And lastly, I'm using an acronym which is often like a roar, that is roar. That's the right answer for the wrong reason. As we shall see in the videos that follow, we shall also be arriving at the same remedy, but for the right reasons. Getting the right answer for the wrong reason is not the way homeopathy is supposed to work. I shall now sum up what we have discussed in this video. The first thing that we looked at was the term likelihood ratio, which is also known as Bayesian statistics, very useful, especially in the medical field when it comes to determining the correlation between causes, effects, and outcomes. The second point that we discussed was this can be used as a basis for determining the hierarchy of symptoms and using it as a filter to weed out those symptoms which do not have any value on the basis of likelihood ratio. We also saw how important it is to weigh mind symptoms and how the likelihood ratio can help us to resolve this issue. And lastly, we had a brief look at the art of synthesizing, how to combine the rubrics by combining or crossing in order to make a more compact repertorial analysis and not bias the results in favor of one particular remedy by repeatedly putting in a symptom that favors one particular remedy. Just as we have a practitioner's bias, which happens in the mind of a practitioner, this is a reality that occurs for a remedy by repeatedly putting in a symptom which essentially means the same thing, and that only overemphasizes one and only one remedy over and over again. So as I said earlier, coming up next is the analysis of the case, remedy selection, and remedy relationships, which will help us to find a remedy to follow or a collateral to complete the cure if that is required at a later stage. So that brings us to the end of this video. So thank you very much for your attention, and we shall meet again in the following videos to complete our analysis of this case. Bye bye.